and welcome to Carnegie Europe. Thank you very much for joining us today, for braving the traffic on a day of strike. And we shall start, but Katerina Masanova, who is one of our speakers, will be joining us in a few minutes. She is stuck in traffic. I'm very happy to be able to moderate this session with Gwendolyn Sasse on the occasion of the publication of her book, Russia's War Against Ukraine. Gwen is a colleague, a non-resident fellow here at Carnegie Europe, but she is also the director of ZOIS, the Center for Studies in Eastern Europe and International Studies in Berlin, and is also professor of comparative politics at the University of Oxford, and is a real expert on Eastern Europe and Ukraine in particular for the past couple of decades.
I'm at Oxford. I'm at Humboldt University Berlin now.
All right.
I used to be
okay. So Gwen has written a book which I really recommend you can pick it up after the event. It's concise, very well written, but it really manages to concentrate some of the big debates around why Russia invaded Ukraine and what is Ukraine about in a condensed and very accessible way. So I do recommend you read it, and I think what you're trying to do, I felt when I was reading it, I really felt that, Gwen, you were, shall we say, dissatisfied with some of the debates around the invasion of Ukraine, and you wanted to debunk some myths that clearly have been seeping through the debate across Europe. I would say also in different ways in different countries. In Germany, there's one debate. In other countries, there are different types of debates. So that felt that it was your sort of motivation for doing that. So shall we just start from that? Pick and choose a few of the myths that need to be debunked in order to understand what is happening at the moment.
Thank you so much, Rosa, and thank you to you and to the whole team here at Carnegie Europe to make this happen and to launch my book here. That feels very special. It is my own translation of an earlier edition in German that came out last year, and now I've reworked it a bit and updated it, needed, unfortunately, updates, but the bulk of it is still the same, the main arguments, and you picked up on this correctly, that I, as somebody who has studied Eastern Europe, but in particular Ukraine for many years, there are not so many social scientists outside Ukraine who work specifically on the country. And I felt a lot of things we as a collective, probably should have understood better. And maybe it is also a matter, or one of the problems might also have been that it was harder to find the space to talk about Ukrainian society, Ukrainian politics, beyond maybe narrower circles in the scholarly community or in maybe narrower policy circles. And you may very well also think it's a mad thing to write a book about the war as the war is going on. And I think it is. It is a bit crazy, but because it mostly tries to focus on the context and how this could happen and what we really need to actually know about Ukrainian society and Ukrainian politics. And one thing before I come to maybe three myths, as you called them, one thing maybe on terminology. I think it's very important these days to, and not only these days, but during a war in particular, to name things appropriately, because I think what we call something shapes the way we not only discuss it, but also how we think about policy responses. And I'm surprised that, almost 20 months after the start of the full-scale invasion, we every day hear about the Ukraine war, maybe slightly more, at least geographically correctly, war in Ukraine, but Ukraine war, sometimes Ukraine crisis was in particular in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, a term often used. And all of these terms suggest that there's an internal problem in Ukraine. And it also, already in the terminology, you need to hear Russia. It's Russia's war against Ukraine. And I think it's important to name it that. And it's against the Ukrainian state. It's against the Ukrainian nation. That's what it's ultimately about. And every other terminology hides that, and that has consequences which we maybe sometimes underestimate. And I also think that we have got to a point in the also political discussions around the war, its implications, Western and not only Western responses to it, where on the one hand, there's an omnipresence of the war. No? We're flooded by images. We are hearing a lot about very specific, also technical details of different weapon systems. It is now part of, it seems, every European or Western country's electoral campaign, the whole issue. And so we can't really get away from it, but nevertheless, I feel that maybe unlike right after February 2022, we've moved further away, strangely enough, so it's a paradox. We've moved further away in our discussion, I think, from what's actually and what was happening on the ground and what Ukrainian society and politics was about. And I think that needs to be quickly sort of rebalanced in the discussion to also find the commitment and the arguments why Western EU and broader Western and NATO support will be needed for a long time. And without really returning in a way to the basics of what this is all about, that would be a lot harder or maybe impossible. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions around Ukraine, and I fear that probably you in this room, or I don't fear, it's a good thing, you will not share these misconceptions, but maybe it's a common task then to make sure that we address this all the time to get it into the broader, also public debate and discussion. And one is, we often hear the phrase that Ukraine is being born as a state and nation in front of our eyes since February 2022. I mean, this is, if nothing else, probably an insult. I mean, Ukraine as a nation starts like many as an idea in the 19th century, and then political consequences come out of that. But if we don't even go that far back, but start with 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, then there are, in particular, there's a series of events which really shows clearly how clear the political choice that Ukraine as a society has made, how far that has come. And it's what I'm talking about is that Ukraine is a country, as you probably all know, and I'm just reminding you of it here and in my book, that has gone through several cycles of mass mobilization. Now, mass protests where literally hundreds of thousands of people go into the street are really rare events. If that happens several times within the space of very few years, then that expresses something about society, and it also changes society, both in terms of perceptions, networks, and political expectations. I think little maybe used reference point these days is the referendum before some of these mass protests occurred in Ukraine in 1991, even before the Soviet Union collapses. A very clear majority of the population of the then Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic expressed a very clear opinion about independence, and that was also the case in the south and east of Ukraine with 80 to 90%, and even in Crimea, where the majority was slim. It was 54% or slimmer, but nevertheless, it was a majority. So Ukraine starts into its independence 1991 with a very clear vote for independent statehood. And then through these cycles, I detail that more in the book. If we think about already before the collapse of the Soviet Union, one big protest, but then 2001, then 2004, the Orange Revolution, 2013, 14. These are masses in the street, and they are peaceful protests. Part of the misunderstanding of protests or the Euromaidan in Ukraine is that it is often told from the end, and the images dominating our perception, public perception of the Euromaidan is the burning Maidan and our right-wing extremist groups in the square. But that is not how it starts. It starts from the middle of society, and it is about fighting corruption, a corrupt regime. And so through these cycles, I think a very clear understanding in Ukraine shaped what kind of political choice society had made. A second myth, if you like, but it's still lingering, is that Ukraine is a divided country. I mean, the first point was really about a political choice of the majority of the country, but the second one is this division into East and West, and division between Russians and Ukrainians in Ukraine, between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine. And it was always, and it's extremely well documented in research, in opinion polls, and beyond that, that in daily life, that distinction between who speaks Russian and Ukrainian was not a per se conflictual one. So this is our perception, again, as a term I use loosely here, is, I think, in my view, also a reflection of a Western gaze onto Eastern Europe, where we look for ethnic and linguistic differences, and then they mean conflict. This was not in daily life in the south and east of Ukraine the case. And many people have mixed backgrounds. For example, census categories never really allow this in-betweenness. Also languages, one person can speak one language, the other. They understand each other, it's not an issue, or you change between different settings of your life in private or outside. So I think that is one of the biggest misunderstandings about Ukraine, and it is politically relevant because on top of that, from outside and sometimes also inside in Ukraine, in the political discourse, labels like pro-Russian were put on top of that. So if you speak Russian, if you live in Eastern Ukraine, if you vote for parties which were only ever conglomerates of different interests, in particular economic interests, that makes you pro-Russian. And that is a shorthand that maybe is often used, but it's deeply misleading. And there were no easy kind of pro-Russian views what that means. We can go more into that if you like. And the third myth, and I think I'm talking too long already, or there's a whole bundle of myths around Crimea. And even before the full-scale invasion in 2022, I think also many Western policymakers, but also analysts, maybe also the wider public debate, while the sentence started with, this was a violation of international law, there was often a but added at the end. And then the but was, yeah, but historically, it is really Russian, isn't it? But that's already problematic. And this, I think, hasn't gone away. And it means that, in a way, I don't think it's only disinformation coming from the Kremlin. It's actually even worse than that. But it means we have accepted a story that Crimea's history starts in 1783. Who was there before? We don't really know. We don't know very much about the Crimean Tatars. But it's also not, I'm not proposing an argument that we weigh how many years somebody ruled over Crimea. That's besides the point. But it's not a very differentiated view of the region, and to kind of buy into a cultural political argument that this bit of territory has and was always Russian is highly problematic and very hard, it seems, to get rid of. I mean, international law is very clear, but around these arguments, around this but, is a number of kind of images almost that just don't disappear. I mean, this illegitimate presence Khrushchev made, basically made Ukraine in 1954. This is a common reference point. I mean, it's not even historically in terms of the archival evidence. He wasn't in any position to just give away territory, and plus a procedure of sorts was followed. And it was also, I think, the main argument at the time was that it made more sense administratively speaking, because it was even less developed than the rest of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So to integrate it, for different reasons, but nevertheless, it lingers on this image of, oh, it was just given away and it didn't really belong there. So those things I think are important to get right and talk about. And the last element, really, I think, of this Crimea myth is that without, maybe because not enough attention is being paid to these things in public debate, I think quite a few people accept these days that before 2014, before the occupation and annexation of Crimea, there was mobilization in Crimea to be part of Russia. But that's not the case. There was some in the 1990s, and there Crimea was a complicated issue, and it was dealt with politically. And since then, Crimea was politically completely integrated in the south and the east of Ukraine. But I think what is also lingering is that there was a public sentiment in Crimea and people mobilized to be part of Russia. That's not the case. It happened, it surprised the Crimeans as it surprised everybody else, including Russians, what happened in 2014. So I think I've already spoken for too long. I'll stop here, but I want to just emphasize there's a few other things in the book too, mostly also focusing on that we shouldn't say the war that started in 2022 because it didn't. It started in 2014. Occupying and annexing Crimea is an act of war. It continued in Donbass and it unfortunately continues today. So my final point is really going back to the beginning. I think we need to get the story right and frame it right, and then also political implications follow from that.
Thank you very much, Gwen. I do have a follow-up question for you, but before I do that, I'd just like to welcome Katerina Matanova, who has recently been nominated the EU ambassador to Ukraine and has very kindly taken some time out of her busy schedule in these 2 days in Brussels to join us. I'm delighted that you can be with us. And prior to becoming EU ambassador, Katerina was the Deputy Director General of DG Neighbourhood and Enlargement, DG NEA for short, at the European Commission. And in the past, you were on the, am I correct in thinking you were on the negotiating team of Slovakia to join the EU, or is that, yeah, okay. So a long history, professional history of engaging with Central and Eastern Europe. But before, Katerina, I invite you to join, I mean, Gwen just kind of debunked, for us, just 3 myths. There, of course, there are more in the book, but there's just one thing I'd like to ask you, because you've done a lot of work on understanding identities, and in fact, you hinted at this when you were speaking. You know, depending on the type of question that is asked, you'll get a certain box will be ticked in the census, and you know, there's a whole issue about methodology. But at the same time, I think you're probably one of the few scholars who's really looking at how societies and identities are changing. So can you just tell us a little bit about Ukraine's identity? Because a lot of people were surprised by the response to the war and have been wondering, you know, what will this mean? You and I are working together. We have an initiative called Ukrainian Voices, which is really trying to think deep into society and long-term about what is all this about. Can you maybe say, you know, how have these identities changed? Is it, you know, are we seeing a shift from a very civic identity to something that might be different after the war because of the experience of war? How do you see that?
Yes, very good question, very big question. As I already hinted at it, and obviously scholars are also part of that, because by creating categories that people then have to choose, that is always an artificial exercise. And if we ask around this room, we all have different identities. Why would we only pin down kind of a Ukrainian with one identity or another? And these in-between categories have become the standard to include them, not in censuses, but in opinion poll research in Ukraine and elsewhere. And then there's a tendency that people use them more and more. But what's a clear trend in basically, I think, through Ukraine's entire period since 91, but then in particular again since 2013-14, is a more conscious, I would say, based on the data I've collected, a more conscious really identification as a citizen of Ukraine. So that's what we mean when we say civic identity. You know, so often civic and ethnic identities are kind of put as sort of different elements there, and the civic really puts the emphasis on being a citizen and therefore having political ideas about who belongs to the country, and that becomes stronger and stronger, and is consistently then the majority category picked if you give people even a very elaborate long choice of different ways in which they could think about identity. And I don't see that kind of changing now. On the contrary, that's been enhanced, and what that means is it subsumes all other identities that you also have, local ones, regional ones, if language and ethnicity matters to you, and those are obviously there are categories that do matter. But they were already less important, and I see that even more the case now. What we also see in terms of it probably goes a bit beyond identity. We could see in, say, I mean, if we look even until 2022, Ukraine was also comparatively speaking, not just in Eastern Europe, but also beyond that, a very interesting case, and I think this didn't get enough attention. For example, during the pandemic, when we compare to other European societies, where the trend is that people do not like their political institutions. They even have doubts about democracy as being the system that deals best with these challenges. In Ukraine, that's not the case. There's actually, and we still don't really know, I'm working with a bigger team, also including Ukrainian scholars on this, but we could see a surprising trend in the opposite direction in Ukraine. So there's more faith in democracy, there's a strong sense of a civic identity, and there is also a rapid increase, and again, already through these cycles of protest, it starts earlier, of not necessarily political engagement in the sense of supporting political parties, but volunteering in all kinds of shapes and forms. And I think all of this together explains at least parts of the strength of and resilience of the Ukrainian society now.
Thank you, Gwen. I'd like to bring in Katerina. Welcome. So we've had Gwen sort of, looking at some, I call them myths. I mean, that, to be honest, that's a word that I use. Your book is much more serious than that. but looking at some misconceptions or flawed ideas about Ukraine. The book also looks at flawed ideas about Russia. What about Europe, the EU, and Ukraine? What do you want to give us your insights, given your position now?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor, Gwen, to be on a panel with you. I had a similar experience with Timothy Snyder, because both you and him are people I quote on panels, and so it's really very, very nice to be here. And I'll get to the EU angle, but if I may pick up on the theme that Gwen started, because. And I see my friend Georg Ziegler, he and I were working together in the support group for Ukraine. And so he heard me say this many, many times about the mythology that people operate under when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, many, many myth is something that unfortunately a lot of our public policy was based on for many, many years. And now, tragically, there are consequences of acting on mythology and prejudices and mistaken beliefs that we see what's happening on the battlefield. Quick question: are we under Chatham House rules, or
No,
we're not? Okay, just to...
No, there are people connected online. We had a lot of registrations.
Okay.
I mean, in the hundreds. So.
Excellent. I think that, as you also say, the mythology about Ukraine and about Russia is very much intertwined. And what I always say about Ukraine, it has been the most unknown largest country in Europe. We knew practically nothing about the history, about the demography, about the political situation, about the economy, old history, recent history, practically nothing. We lived under the impression, it's like Russia, they just speak a funny language, and even not all of it. And a more recent myth, which was heavily subsidized by healthy and well-funded Russian propaganda. They are so corrupt, they're practically a failed state. Today, former president of the European Commission opines in this regard. And I'll get to that in a second, because there's always myth is based on some truth, but this was another big myth, but based on the really not knowing anything about Ukraine, not knowing that they were the largest victim of not only Holocaust, Holocaust and the Second World War. It was Ukraine and Belarus that percentage-wise suffered by far more than the rest of the Soviet Union. They were the target of a similar massacre on industrial scale called Holodomor by Stalin. And these are things that you people who are really connoisseurs may have heard about, but this was not part of the general knowledge. And so the discovery of Ukraine really happened only in this terrible second phase of the war since the 2022 escalation. And I just, like you, sometimes I catch myself calling it since the war, and then I catch myself, we really cannot say that because the war started in 2014. So I think that this lack of knowledge really was a breeding ground for the mythology, and the fact that really even historically the path of the two countries is very different, right? Ukraine was established by the Vikings, we had the Polish, Lithuanian, I forget how it was called, a Commonwealth, and then you had the Mongolian horde establishing the Muscovy, right? So there is a very, very different path. And on your second question that you posed to Gwen, there actually is a difference when you I have spent many years working in Russia, and also many years with Ukraine, and there is simply a difference in the interaction. In Russia, every human interaction is a zero-sum game. The concept of what we are used to on a daily basis is here, that human interactions, business interactions, political interaction need to be a win-win situation. That's simply very difficult to achieve. And I haven't really spent a lot of time in Russia outside of Moscow, so this is simply even a Moscow experience. But that's a little bit beside the point. But mainly it's the lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, and really discovering Ukrainians now that is part of why we acted the way we acted. Collectively, West bought into the notion, oh, Russia feels threatened by NATO expansions, above their security guarantees, as if somebody was attacking them historically, right? I mean, they came into Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia 68, 2008 Georgia, 2014 Russia, 2007 they brought down Estonian e-government. I mean, there are successive aggressive behavior by Russia that we were not looking at, and then we were caught surprise in February of last year. So that's one point I want to make. And then the other one, I mentioned the myth on my favorite one on oh, they're so corrupt, they're practically a failed state, because that was a very, very convenient issue to take up and spread through the massive and very capillarily successful Russian propaganda outlets, because that's something that speaks to the West. And it's echoed without any really understanding and knowledge. I'm not saying there is no corruption in Ukraine. On the contrary, yes, there is corruption in Ukraine. And yes, even in the transparency perceptions index, it's actually ranked. I laugh when I hear that it's ranked grosso modo the same as Russia. Yes, because there is actually an active attempt since 2014 to do something about it. And since the Maidan revolution, the combination of internal pressure from the very, very right, you talked about civic identity and civic activism. One of the strengths of Ukraine is the civil society and the organizational capacity of the resilience that they have by really this voluntarism, activism around causes, around services that need to be delivered, etc. And so that internal pressure combined with media, free media, and the international pressure, there actually a lot has been done about corruption. Because if they were so corrupt as the Russian narrative that was bought into those, they would have fallen like a house of cards when February of last year came. And they didn't. I mean, you can't on the one hand say, oh, they are so rotten, they really are practically a failed state. And on the other hand, be admiring the resilience and actually the buildup of the institutions. I mean, I just came from Kyiv on Tuesday. We had 24 ministers of foreign affairs on Monday in Kyiv. I mean, the logistics were impeccable on their side. Quite different to the dramas we had before. So even the stress and the pressure actually led to a much stronger state, continued strong civil society, and at the same time the messy democracy that they're famous for. So just to finish, Rosa, on your question, I mean, I think on the EU side, and thanks to President von der Leyen's leadership on this and President Michel as well, I mean, I think that there is very much strong institutional support, political, technical, financial, and we are busily preparing the enlargement report. There are still some issues to finalize, but I think it's very much moving hopefully in a positive direction. But I did notice the very active counter move in the media in the last 2 weeks. I mean, Politico particularly is profiling itself on creating a controversy, and it is so it's a very much a live subject, because obviously the prospect of Ukraine in the European Union is a legitimately scary one for the current members for a variety of reasons. We can get into it, but this is the largest country in Europe, so it's not an easy prospect from any perspective.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I have loads of questions to ask you both, but I won't, because I'd like to open it up to people. We can take questions from the people who are here in the room, but I think we can also take questions from people who are online. So type them in, and I will receive them and read them out. Of course, and you guys, you can put your hand up and I'll pay attention to who wants to come in first. But of course, we have tomorrow, the leaders are meeting. Today, there was the European Political Community meeting, which again was, well, we mentioned Politico today, was talking about the process being in a coma, but it's only just being born, so perhaps it's a little bit premature to start calling for a coma. But of course, the situation in the countries covered by the European Political Community hasn't been good, and there was Azerbaijan's blitz on Nagorno-Karabakh, which was really tainted the mood of the meeting. But then tomorrow, EU leaders are going to be talking about the reform needed in order to enlarge, because in December, big decisions need to be taken. So, well, if nobody has a question, then maybe I'll ask both of you, where do you think this is going? And I mean, there are lots of debates around dates and whether it's smart to put a date out there, 2030, or whether one should, keep it as an open process. But I think there's obviously a big debate about EU reform, what type of reform is needed. I mean, there's two big issues. One is representation of member states, so voting rights, numbers of commissioners, etc., QMV, etc., but also financing all this. So I mean, what do you think? I think maybe two points. What is the biggest problem with respect to Ukraine, and what is the biggest thing that Ukraine brings to the table if we want to enlarge? I'll put that out there for you while waiting for people to put their hands up. So, Katrina, do you want to start? Because I know you have an answer to this.
I'll try to be quick. And this is something I started telling my Ukrainian friends both bilaterally and in various interviews. You know, they're fighting a war, so naturally they are sort of inward-looking, right? And need support from everybody. But I'm trying to explain to them that the enlargement process is not only about them. That they need to do reforms. They're absolutely indispensable. They're certainly not ready to join next year or the year after, but I do believe they're ready to start negotiating, but they have a lot of really transformational work to do. But it's also about the reform of the EU. This is something that not everybody there gets, because they're like, okay, we need to do this, but the fear about Ukraine joining is legitimate. It's both about policies, right? I mean, one will have to fundamentally rejig, especially the two sacred policies, the structural funds and CAP, Common Agricultural Policy. But I think it's much more fundamental. You mentioned the voting process and representation of the EU. This is a fundamental issue. At 27, the system is sort of showing cracks in the decision making, and expanding it by a number or by such a big country, it would be really so. This is one issue that is not trivial, and nobody wants to do it in a vacuum, right? So it will have to happen as part of in parallel to negotiations. But I think it's even more fundamental. And I'm from a country that was part of the 2004 enlargement. The 2004, 2007, and 2013 enlargements did not fundamentally alter the center of gravity and center of power in the EU. If Ukraine joins, it will. And that's something that is very, you know, power is a finite, that is a zero-sum game. Power in the EU is a zero-sum game. So if the pie is divided by more, somebody is on the losing end. So that's a legitimate concern of the ins, right? Mm-hmm. Because that is a big thing. So I think that's those two, both the mechanics of decision making, but also addressing this fear, or at least discussing it and having it out in the open, I think is something that needs to happen. Now, what Ukraine has to bring to the table, I have my 7 points: resilience, human capital. It's the most digitalized country in Europe. Agricultural, food security, green, energy potential, energy supplies, and the best army that we could ever dream of.
When?
There's hardly anything left, I think. But maybe as an 8th point on the list, I mean, also starting negotiations with a country where society knows exactly what it is fighting for at the moment and which political choice it has made is also something, it could be something very reinvigorating for the EU as a whole, where those things are either taken for granted or they are dangerously slipping. So maybe if the list can take more, then I think that Ukraine brings as well. I have nothing to add to all the things you said, but I think one, now speaking as somebody who doesn't have to make it happen in practice, I see this tension though, no? The more the focus now is on reforming the whole of the EU to make it happen, the less likely it's going to happen. The political momentum is also important, and I think maybe it's also one of those moments where, or I think it is one of those moments where we need to also remember sort of how the EC or EU came about, and certain moments, there is a political choice ultimately each enlargement also was not only a technocratic process, but a political choice. And in the whole history of the EU, there's these moments where big, bold choices are made, and this is one of them. And the question is if the EU is capable of doing it. If, of course, all these reform issues inside the EU are important, they will have to be addressed alongside. But I sort of fear, and I hear from various member states' capitals, the more the emphasis is on one, the less this momentum can really probably thrive. At the same time, if it turns too much into a technocratic process of getting the negotiations done, then politics will intervene at every stage to stop it at the last moment, and that could also be a big problem. So I can see it as from different sides, but these tensions, I think, will have to be, maybe as you say, be out in the open and then openly be discussed.
Thank you very much, Gwen. So I have three people. Thank you very much. First of all, Patrick, just there, and then the lady with the lovely green jacket, and then the gentleman at the end. And another question. Fantastic. So we've got four. So maybe we'll take two and two. Patrick.
Thanks. As a new official, but as a non-Ukraine expert, a question. I was very intrigued by what you said about the growing sense of civic identity of Ukrainians, and this idea that it was in a way, a myth of divisions between Russian and Ukrainian speakers. Just to give an example of something I saw that maybe you could then frame it. I was really quite shocked to see photos a few weeks ago of statues of Pushkin being taken down in Ukrainian cities. And I just would like to understand or have some sense of an understanding with that in the context of the description of identity that you've given, because I find it hard to do that. It's hard not to see a sense of division between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers in Ukraine if Russian authors become part of the enemy in some way.
My name is Katie Chumbadze. I'm Deputy Head of Georgian Mission in the EU. First, thank you very much to the organizers and distinguished panelists for this discussion, because the exchanges about the root causes of the Russian aggression in Ukraine is very much important, not only because of keeping and further consolidation of the support to Ukraine, but also for European security and Europe itself. And my question actually is also regarding the Europe and European security. On the one hand, we definitely see the huge difference because after 2022, a lot of things have been changed in the EU and in the global agenda, which wasn't the case 15 years ago when Russia launched the pattern of military aggressions, particularly at the time in Georgia in 2008. And as our today's speaker mentioned, in 2014, there were a lot of buts over the Crimea. In 2008, in Ukraine, there were even more buts. We definitely lack the understanding of the root causes of Russia's aggressive pattern. So my question is to both speakers, whether how do you see actually how the better understanding after 15 years, better understanding of the root causes of Russia's aggressive behavior has been translated in the political will and the geopolitical foreign policy of the institutions and the member states. And despite the fact that this is also, the enlargement is the merit-based process, and at the same time it is the most powerful transformative instrument in Eastern European countries like Ukraine, Moldova or Georgia, how do you see that this understanding will be translated in the political decision in December to advance these three countries further in the enlargement process? Thank you.
Ask Gwen perhaps to start, and then Katerina.
Yes. I mean, on the first question about the Pushkin monuments, I wasn't present, but my theory would at least be that Russian speakers were among the ones taking those monuments down at this point. So it's not about language at all. It's not about ethnicity in a narrow sense either. This is happening amidst this war, and a war of the dimensions we're seeing, and it reflects on a longer colonial legacy. So that's what this is about. It's not about every single work by Pushkin, but it's about what it symbolizes and how come he stands everywhere and nobody else, and how come we all know Pushkin but we hardly know any Ukrainian writers. So I think it's in that context. I'm not saying that that will change by taking the monument down, but that's sort of the context in which I would place that. But it has nothing to do with that either before 2022 or even now. It's about language, or if we, even the reports we get from the front lines, if we listen closely, it's the soldiers are speaking Russian in Donbass. So it's not about language. It's about something to do with what Ukraine is, and it's a diverse society because of its history, being part of different empires. But even now, it's not about language. Having said that, there is an issue or a question, open question, will it become more about language in the future? I think we also have to ask tough questions, and I think that's probably where you wanted to go before as well. We also don't know whether the society that is so resilient and united now, what will be the social and political dividing lines after the war, if we can even allow ourselves already to think about this. And there might be those issues being used as one way of differentiating in a field that does not offer many political alternatives. It's clear where the country wants to go. So that doesn't preclude the possibility, a painful possibility, that those types of issues will be revived instrumentally as that. But at the moment, I think that is even less likely. I think what's more likely is that dividing lines in society will be around who did what in the war and who was where during the war, those kinds of issues, and who and what can be done for a whole range of different vulnerable groups, and will they be left behind in various processes of reconstruction, EU accession, and so on. So I think the Pushkin monuments is a sideshow, and that's not it's not really the main issue.
Actually, the next publication of Ukrainian Voices will be focusing precisely on that. Katerina.
Just one sentence. Gwen used the word, and I very much agree with it. And this is how you're actually seeing a little more support, quite a bit more support from third countries to Ukraine, because they are taking great efforts, the Ukrainians now, and explain to countries in Africa and Asia that this is a colonial war. I mean, it is a colonial legacy, it is a colonial war, everything around it. So I think that's very much, we were in with High Representative Borrell in Odessa last Saturday, and we went to the opera. They were playing a Saturday matinee. We went for 2 minutes to see the thing, and yeah, they told us that they are not playing Russian operas or ballet. So it's the same. Perhaps the tearing down the Catherine the Great statues is even a little more symbolic of what Gwen was saying. Now to your question, I think that your first question was actually an answer, is the understanding of the roots of Russian aggression that led to what we are seeing now. I mean, I think that since this phase of the war, this large escalation in February, European common foreign and security policy came of age. I mean, let's just look at the facts. I would not have expected that it's going to be the EU that will be the arms supplier, and with a relatively timid to non-existent role of NATO headquarters, right? I mean, it's NATO member states, but not the HQ that is active, and we are now on discussing the 8th tranche of something called European Peace Facility, which which refinances the arm deliveries to Ukraine. So, and obviously we can talk about the unity, about the sanctions, but this last bit is really the most symbolic maturing of what the European defense dreams were about. I mean, this was simply unimaginable before February of last year. And the same thing goes for the enlargement. I mean, I always say, if it wasn't for the February invasion, we would not be discussing enlargement and the 3 eastern countries in one breath. But equally, I would say that it's the work that we have done with the countries and the reforms that the 3 countries have gone through since the adoption of since the entering into the association agreement that even made the discussion possible. I do state that there is still a long way to go, but they have gone, all 3 countries, through really big transformational steps over the last 10 years. And that even made it possible to be where we are. But we are certainly not, the road is long and winding ahead still. And I do believe, I mean, I may be proven wrong, I do believe there will be opening of negotiations for the 2 candidates. Georgia is a more complicated case because it's the signals that Georgian leadership is sending with the actions over the last year are mixed, are confusing, I would say. So, but what I always tell my Georgian friends, the biggest delta is between having a European perspective and not having it. And you have European perspective. You're part of the enlargement package. You will be reported on ad nauseam every year. So the train has not left the station. But I think that Georgia will have to make its own choices and then behave accordingly to the choices.
Thank you very much. I have 2 more questions, and I need to ask you to be, one and two. I need to ask you to be brief because we need to come to the end of this event. Please.
Thank you so much.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Sean Brent. I'm from Hungary. I'm part of the Young European Federalists. It was really fascinating to hear and also to see in the past months how the war has impacted the EU, from energy crisis to refugees, to disinformation, to different kind of identity conflicts. But obviously enlargement is kind of one of the biggest thing around here. But I think the elephant in the room is peace also. And there's a lot of myths about peace as well and about the actors involved in peace. I would be interested in your take about the possibility of peace and about these myths of actors involved with the peace and role of the European Union playing in this one.
Hop to the end of the room so that we can get a last comment or question. Again, brevity would be good.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this fabulous discussion. I'm Ukrainian. And before I make a question, can I make a very brief comment about Pushkin? Because I'm from Kharkiv, and my city was actually one of the first cities that shut down Pushkin's monuments. And I can briefly explain the logic why actually it's happening. If you research more, what is actually the concept of Russian world mean? It was drafted by Medinsky and Dugin. Maybe you know that, guys. Yes, and it's actually about 3 things. First of all, it's whenever in this world where people speak in Russian, where people admire Russian culture, and where people is afraid of weapon, they consider it as a territory of Russian world. And as you see, Ukraine is not going to be a part of Russian world, and we're actually trying to get rid of that heritage. And myself, I'm fluent in Russian and Ukrainian, but I'm trying to forget Russian language, as well as forget all Pushkin poems. So it's kind of that logic behind of that, because it's just everything about imperialistic colonial heritage that we want to get rid of. But my question will not be about that. Maybe a little bit, but I'm researching propaganda, Russian propaganda in particular, and I want to ask you about historic narrative propaganda, because I think it's one of the most toxic kind of propaganda. How actually we can combat here? Do you have any ideas? Yeah, So if you can comment, and thank you, Katerina, for being Ukrainian voice here and combating these narratives and explaining actually people here how Ukrainians are thinking. Thank you so much about that.
Thank you. Katerina, shall we start with you and then Gwen?
How to think about peace? Well, first, I think that there's nobody who wants peace more than the Ukrainians, and then Zelensky and his team and every single Ukrainian, because they are the ones who are suffering not only on the battlefield. Today, 49 people were killed in a shopping mall and a restaurant, or I believe 49 casualties by being bombed in a civilian place. This is something that is not talked about enough, that since October of last year, we are coming up on the first anniversary. They have started systematically killing and going after civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, theaters, restaurants, energy supplies, energy grid. And so so that's one other myth that war is. I mean, these are war crimes, right? It's going after civilian population. Peace is going to unfortunately come when there is going to be enough of a military advantage of one over the other. I mean, I'm afraid that right now both sides think they can win, and that's not a path to peace. But nobody wants it more than the Ukrainians.
Gwen.
Yes, I think maybe one common misunderstanding there is that often sort of war and in terms of military, financial assistance and negotiations and ceasefire and so on are seen as alternatives. And I think they're not. I think that's a big conceptual mistake. And I think at the moment, assistance to Ukraine is trying to create the foundations for something to be negotiated eventually. There will be eventually some negotiations that can actually last. At the moment, there's none of these conditions in place. And plus, we also know from all opinion polls that the Ukrainian population would not support any deal made right now. Interesting, I think, that it's interesting to me that all the suggestions, and we hear more and more of them, I think, that there should be now some ceasefire and there should be some negotiations, and how about Crimea, how about this? It always starts on the Ukrainian end. No? This is sort of a curious pattern. It's never saying what sort of some people in the Kremlin would have to do, and it's very clear. I don't know if these are true figures, probably not, but the Russian budget makes it very clear, the new budget figures for 24, 26 to 26, that Russia is in it for a long haul and is changing its economy to make this last and so on. So that it's very hard to see where the political will can even come from on the Russian side. So I think in my book somewhere I put it like this, that Ukraine has no basis to negotiate and Russia doesn't want to negotiate. So unfortunately, I think that's the position we're at, and it means and the West, the EU, NATO has a part in this and plays an important part. And it's not going to just resolve itself automatically, or at least hopefully not, because then it's going to end badly for Ukraine. But I think this perception also that this will last a long time and that this will require a commitment in terms of the assistance to Ukraine, but also a commitment in terms of societies in Western Europe, in the West, why this is happening and why this is also incurring costs elsewhere. This is partly where I started, and I think we need to sometimes go back to the basic why this is actually happening, because of that. Without that, it could be over for Ukraine at some point in circumstances when there's nothing really to negotiate, and when ideas that are sometimes launched about freezing conflicts. I think we should have learned by now that freezing any conflict means it just postpones all the issues and it'll break open again, as we've just seen now in Nagorno-Karabakh as well. I've seen in Georgia before, I've seen in Ukraine before, in Donbass in particular. It just postpones issues, dynamics change somewhat, and then it breaks open again. And what would be frozen would be also a significant part of the Ukrainian population living under Russian occupation and all that brings with it. So I think that's a reality that we need to always think about. But then also not thinking it's only one or the other. And the key thing I think will be to not miss the moment when something changes in the political system in Russia. That is not impossible, but it's also not forthcoming anytime soon, I think. But then another dynamic could start.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you all for coming, and all those who've connected online. It was great to have you. We'll be continuing to talk about Ukraine in many ways, both from the point of view of geopolitics, the war, but also from the point of view of Ukrainian society and what's happening there, and of course, from the point of view of the European Union and what's going to happen to the enlargement process. So follow our activities, and thank you all for coming.